for taking time out of your day and come to this rather warm room to hear a few words about a history topic. Over the last several years, the Development Department has asked me each year to give a presentation of some kind on Alumni Weekend. And in the past, I have chosen usually historical events that we're celebrating, if that's the right word, or commemorating the 100th or 200th anniversary. Last year, 2015 was, of course, the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. The year before that, the 200th anniversary of the outbreak of the most disastrous war in history. I thought this year, however, for the last presentation, I would do something a little different. If I wanted to do something the 100th anniversary of, then it would have been the battles of the Somme and Verdun, which would be a pretty depressing topic to mar your afternoons with. And I thought instead a larger topic like why study history at all. I managed, after a lot of cogitation, to come up with some reasons why. In fact, I realized that I had probably bitten off a little more than I could chew to pick such a topic. And this lecture is probably not so tautly organized as some that I've given, where if you're dealing with a specific event, it's a little clearer the path you have to go. I want to at least touch on the necessity of history, the purpose of history, the relevance of history, the power of history, and all in 35 minutes or so. So perhaps I'll leave something out, but I beg your indulgence here as I give you a few ideas along these lines. We often hear that we cannot live in the past. You cannot live in the past, but of course there is a group of people who do exactly that, namely historians. And it's a thing that is well worth doing. I want to encourage more people to live a little bit in the past because, to use one of the biggest cliches there is, but which, like so many cliches, is true, it's our only guide to the future. Over and over again, it's our only guide to the future. The ancient Greeks seemed to realize that when they made Clio one of the muses, one of the 9 muses, ranking right up there with even lyric poetry, which for a Greek was ranking very high indeed. The duty of history was to record and book and to sound the trump of fame. Although very often it seems, looking at my own career, it's to sound the trump of infamy, if there is such a thing, rather than the trump of fame. Let me add, by the way, that any allusions I should make in my presentation to any contemporary or current political developments or trends are purely coincidental and not made with any partisan intent whatsoever, but merely for illustrative purposes. Really. History is a necessity, whether students or older students in history like it or not, it is a necessity. I don't wish to make invidious comparisons with my colleagues in other fields, but it does seem to me at least that the fact is that many quite advanced societies, and some not so advanced, have gotten along quite well, knowing practically nothing about chemistry or physics. Of course, the laws of physics were operating, but they didn't know that. They've gotten along monoglot, not knowing any foreign languages, and in some cases without any literature because they were illiterate. They managed to get along with those things, but none of them have gotten along without history. It is an absolute basic human need. To the extent that if they didn't have any way of finding out their real history, and of course the ancient Greeks and Romans and many, many others didn't, they made it up because they had to have a history. The Greeks wanted to know where they came from. They called themselves Hellenes, descendants of Helen, not Helen of Troy, but a man with 2 L's, Helen, an eponymous, an ancestor that they were named after. The Romans eventually created the idea that they were descended from the Trojans, and their official government poet wrote the Aeneid to give them the epic that they needed to tell where they came from. Every society has its creation stories because they all have to know some history. It's just absolutely inherent in human nature. And of course, it is nice to know accurate history rather than inaccurate history if you have a choice of doing that. One doesn't always have a choice of doing that, but today, to some extent, we do, although as I'll also show, we have more opportunities for knowing nonsense than ever before as well, which is something to try to guard against. History is one of the most accessible academic fields. The average educated person cannot pick up a calculus book, unless he's talented in math, and read it with enjoyment, or perhaps a chemistry book. But you can pick up any old history book and read it and learn something, hopefully something accurate. This has its dangers too, because there's a lot of history books to pick up. Which one should you pick up? There's only so many hours to read them. There are only so many shows you can watch. Which historical movies are worth seeing? And in that case, you should probably consult a historian. You would not, if you were wise, treat yourself for an illness without consulting a doctor, or go into court without a lawyer, and perhaps a historian could be a guide, so that you won't be reading absolute nonsense like Franklin D. Roosevelt planned Pearl Harbor because he gets into a war, or Churchill sank the Lusitania, or things like that, which you can easily find presented in all of their details if you look at the right, or I should say the wrong places. This accessibility also is sometimes a little tough for history teachers because you will, usually more on the collegiate level or in real life, run into the history buff. The history buff has been defined as the person who knows exactly how many grains of powder were in the cartridge of the M1 rifle, but are a little hazy on the importance of the Battle of Austerlitz. People who are self-appointed experts. I once had an interesting discussion with someone in our dining hall about whether Hitler died in April of 1945 or whether he was alive afterwards, and I was a little intemperate there at that point when this person insisted that he knew that Hitler had not died, because I knew that he did. But consult historians and try to get information that's accurate. What is the purpose of history? History is extremely fortunate in being both very, very old and very, very new. The very first historian, who, as you see, was there a long time ago, of course you don't know what he looked like, but here he is anyway. The very first historian tells us the purpose of history in the very first sentence of the very first history book. Unlike some disciplines, we didn't have to wait for hundreds of years for someone to come along and figure out what we were doing. And what does he tell us in that first sentence of the first history book? Herodotus of Halicarnassus, his researchers are here set down to preserve the memory of the past by putting on record the astonishing achievements, both of our own and of other peoples, and more particularly to show how they came into conflict. To put on record the astonishing deeds of our own and of other peoples. Multicultural history already in the first sentence. Consider everybody, and of course astonishing can have a two-edged sword, two-edged meaning, astonishing by virtue of being good, or simply being amazing, or simply, I suppose, by being awful. And this first historian, who incidentally set standards of impartiality that an awful lot of later historians could only envy. This man wrote the history of the war that threatened the very existence of his Greek state, and yet if you read the book and didn't know it, you wouldn't know he was a Greek, because the Persians are not the bad guys or the evil guys. They are the opponents, but nonetheless, they have their good points too, and it's a remarkable work, especially considering it's the first one. And the second historian, Thucydides, also a Greek, realized very early on problems that all historians are going to have to face. And with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses, whose reports I have checked. Reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Not that even so, the truth was easy to discover. Different eyewitnesses give different accounts of the same events, speaking out of partiality for one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. That we've been dealing with ever since, as have lawyers with witnesses in court. But it's good to know the dangers and the difficulties of the profession from a book that was written 2,400 years ago and is still in print. A remarkable achievement for any author. Of course, I'm going to skip one here. There is also this man, I would say the philosopher that is more quoted and less read than any other philosopher. We've all heard of George Santayana because of one famous quote, and if I were running a class, I'd ask the question now, but I will just say the famous quote, of course, is that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, which sort of was an updating of what Burke said. People will not look forward to prosperity who never look backward to their ancestors. It seems that we repeat the past quite a bit, as a matter of fact, because we don't pay attention to it. But perhaps if we did, we'd be better off, or at least it's safe to say we probably would be a whole lot worse off than we were before. Thucydides, again, is a guide. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Thucydides, there it is. Is a guide to the fact that history teaches lessons in the same passage I was reading from. It may well be that my history will seem less easy to read because of the absence in it of an imaginative element. It will be enough for me, however, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other and in much the same ways be repeated in the future. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever. And the constant reoccurrence of similar events is a theme in history. During the Vietnam War, some historians sent copies of Thucydides to President Johnson with an urging that he read Book 7, which is about the Athenian expedition. The general on the spot says the expedition should be withdrawn, everything's going wrong. What does the assembly do? We'll send you more men, we'll send you more ships, surely we'll win. The end is utter catastrophe, because they would not listen to reason in that case. It is important for societies to come to terms with history, and this they do with better or worse success. Some never do, and yet if you don't know your history and acknowledge it, how can you really construct a coherent future? One example would be the Germans dealing with Hitler. It seems to me that Germany has done as much as any society could ever possibly do in admitting and recognizing the horrors that took place, and in mitigating them now insofar as it's humanly possible to do so. In fact, some might suggest the Germans have gone almost too far in the opposite direction with the complete destruction of their own nationalism at all. But the fact is they have accepted what they've done. Most Americans accept the fact that this great country has also done bad things sometimes. Indeed, every single nation has, and acknowledges mistreatment of American Indians or of our slaves. But other societies have more trouble with that. There is one in Asia that still puts on its currency and praises one of the greatest mass murderers in history. And how can China really have a modern existence if it does not acknowledge the past and stop praising it? Last night, this happens over and over again if you teach history. As I'm browsing the news, I come across a news article. Just last night, this was entirely unplanned. Germany recognizes Armenian genocide. Turkey recalls ambassador. The Turks will not officially admit that they carried out a genocide of the Armenians. But at some point, they really ought to, because how can they be teaching the truth if they don't admit what their previous governments have done? There is still a statue in Belgium to King Leopold II. Leopold II, who massacred God knows how many people in the Congo, a place that he personally owned and farmed for rubber for all that it is worth. These are serious things, but one has to deal with them at some point, one hopes. Another interesting thing, and we've seen this a great deal just in the last few months, is the change of historical reputations. Reputations go up and down. Today's hero is tomorrow's villain. People perhaps should actually study these folks to come to a reasonable conclusion, rather than depending on what the latest web article says. A good example of this, of course, is Napoleon. Here we have a man who is hailed in his own time as the great, well, he was the greatest general, but that's controversial. The great leader who wanted to unite the Europeans with one currency, that he would bring all the European peoples together, a great hero, a man who was destroying the old regime and the tyranny of the old regime, and then he becomes the villain, the warmonger, the man who spread terror through Europe, who invaded everybody, who had to be cast down for the welfare of the common good, and so up and down in history. What is the true Napoleon? Well, the only way to decide for yourself is to study him and reach your own conclusions, because you can support almost anything. But there are more contemporary examples than going back all the way to Napoleon. We can look at other people and other events as well. We were all brought up, or some of us were, with stories of a heroic American who was a small boy, preferred to get a good whipping than to clean the boots of a British officer during the colonial wars, a man who won the Battle of New Orleans, a man who brought popular sovereignty to the White House with the spoils system, and who defended the honor of his wife in many duels. And suddenly, about 2 months ago, other aspects of his career seemed to be more emphasized, like the Trail of Tears and the destruction of the Bank of the United States, and he's banished from the front of the $20 bill, which may be a good idea, but will the real old hickory please stand up? Read about him if you're interested, and judge for yourself. Another more recent figure, an American president, a man who certainly was an honest and decent man. Indeed, that's how he got into politics. He was almost drafted into it. A man who kept us out of war until he didn't. And then went to the Great Peace Conference and at least tried his darndest to bring peace to the world and originate the first functioning League of Nations. A great man. And then suddenly Woodrow Wilson is being attacked as a terrible racist and a man who doesn't deserve to have buildings named after him on the campus of the college in which he was the president. Well, that's a change in reputation. Now, where does Woodrow Wilson stand in all of this? You know, study Woodrow Wilson. And also keep in mind, as I think some people don't know to some extent, that people can do good things and bad things. That nobody is perfect. We would like to have perfect leaders, but we won't get them because the saints aren't going into politics these days. And as a result, perhaps people at different times in their careers are good and bad, and you've got to blame them or praise them exclusively for things. Over and over again in my own courses, I'm used to seeing historical things that I've taught for years simply because they're part of the material, and you teach them, pop up. It might be something very trivial. In 1984, the Winter Olympics were held in Sarajevo, which led some people to realize at some point that the Winter Olympics were not the most significant event that had ever occurred in Sarajevo. A certain event on June the 28th, 1914 was probably more significant, the assassination of the Archduke. I don't know how many Americans knew the meaning of the word demagogue a year ago, but today practically everybody knows the meaning of the word demagogue. Who were the demagogues? What were they like? Well, go to Thucydides and read about Cleon, the man who took over as the popular leader in Athens after the tragic death of Pericles. You'll see a demagogue in action. Use that term about, but find out what it means before you just say a demagogue. But we see how history sort of comes up. It keeps coming up no matter whether you want it to or not. Building democracy. Now there is something near and dear to the hearts of Americans, or at least American presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic. We want to build democracy. Democracy is the finest form of government, we say, in all cases, and if you give people a democracy, surely everything will be fine. Except it isn't, it seems. It was in Japan. What we did for Japan after World War II was a great deed under Douglas MacArthur. I can't imagine an American more fit to be the Emperor of Japan, but under his guidance, Japan did indeed develop a democracy that works. But the Japanese have an almost unique capacity for adapting things to their use, to the benefit to them. Elsewhere, it seems not to work so well, and I think Americans are puzzled. Why can't they be good democratic peoples and have pluralistic democracy in countries where they don't have a word for it until we arrive? Well, take a look at history and see how hard it is to run a democracy. Again, you can always start with Thucydides. Athens, the great democracy that we quite rightfully respect, destroys itself through the bad decisions of the totally democratic assembly. In Germany, after 1918, they have an excellent constitution written by scholars combining the finest examples of the American and British parliamentary systems, guaranteeing all basic rights. You're dealing here with the most highly advanced, highly educated people in the whole of Europe, people whom classical education is a bedrock for their educated classes. And look what happens in 1933. There's no more democracy. In fact, it's the antithesis of it. How would that happen to the Germans? How could they not make democracy work? Well, they didn't, and take my course and find out. Study 20th century Europe and discover how hard it is to make democracy work. Or if you want to take a more long-term view, look at France. The French began building democracy in 1789. And they sort of completed the process of having a democracy in 1875. It took a while. And in between those two dates, they'd had a limited monarchy. And then after they executed the king, they had the Reign of Terror, which was sort of an oligarchy. And then they had a directory, which was another kind of oligarchy. And then they had a very popular absolute ruler, Napoleon. And then they had a quite unpopular restored king, Louis XVIII. And then they had an extremely unpopular king, Charles X, whom they drove out in a revolution. And then they had a sort of middle-class favoring bourgeois king, Louis Philippe. And then they had another revolution. And then they had the Second Republic. No one remembers that because it only lasted 2 years. Because after 2 years, the president of the Second Republic, Louis Napoleon, decided he'd make himself emperor with popular support. And so they had the Second Empire. And then at the end of the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, when the whole regime collapses and is driven out, they spend the next many years deciding what sort of government they have, and by one vote they pass a resolution that uses the word republic, because what else can you call it when you don't have a king anymore? And, it's hard to build democracies. It's very hard. Again, that's just something that the study of history enhances, and you learn more about what's going on, and you find out about things. I think that studying history makes you a little reluctant to make important changes, or at least realize that when change is coming, change is not necessarily good. Be careful what you wish for, you may get it. Our Declaration of Independence, I think, was very wise when the founders wrote, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes." For example, the Kaiser Bill, William II, the militarist, the man surrounded by generals, the bombastic and generally unsuitable Emperor of Germany. Surely we want to get rid of him, so let's get rid of him. And wait a little bit and see what comes next, and then wish we had him back. Or in Russia, the almost comically inefficient Tsarist Romanov dynasty, Nicholas II, a man who was utterly unfit to be a Tsar, very nice man, very bad ruler, a man who surely the time has come for this entire rotten old divine right absolutism idea to disappear, and so let's make it disappear, and wait a little bit and see what you get, and then we wish, gee, where's the Tsar when we need him? Again, studying history makes you think more about the importance of change, the necessity of change, or whether it is really necessary. One of the things that Americans should be aware of, and would be if they studied history, is that in time of stress, or perceived stress, people move to extremes. This always happens. It's exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic, starting in 1930, when the Depression hit. The Nazi Party, which had 2.6% of the vote, suddenly goes to 18% of the vote overnight. And the Communist Party increases its percentage as well, not to that extent. People will go to extremes, and therefore it behooves the parties of the more moderate middle to do something to prevent this from happening if they want to survive, or they will disappear. It's not always a disaster if they disappear, but it is a change. The British Liberal Party pretty well vaporized around 1925-30 because the right wing went to the Tories and the left wing went to the Labour, and then the more liberal party, it's just plain gone. In times of stress, people will tend to go to extremes and seek new leaders. Seek new leaders, possibly from outside the political system. And you'll get them, they will appear, and they may succeed for a while, and then after that they may perhaps not succeed quite so well as previously happened. My point is simply that studying history will teach you some things about this. Will give you something to think about. Will give you something to base your opinions on. Because the fact is, as I mentioned earlier, there is more misinformation available than ever before. The internet is a marvelous way of spreading ideas, but it's also a marvelous way of spreading absolute nonsense. And why do teachers not want students to go to Wikipedia? Wikipedia is fine in many ways. Excellent articles on Wikipedia, lots of information easily available. But unless you already know something about it, you don't know who wrote the articles, and you don't know when suddenly it goes from being a sensible thing to being on the fringe or novel. Again, a historian can guide you in that, whereas other people probably cannot guide you nearly. Historians sometimes fall into the habit of just commenting on them as though they were observers. Thomas Mann, in his rather dense Dr. Faustus, which I nonetheless highly recommend, has a little passage here. The narrator of the book, Dr. Serenus Zeitblom, a nice, average, middle-of-the-road German intellectual in the 1930s, is having a little trouble with some of his colleagues from various fields, not historians necessarily, who seem to recognize what's happening in Germany, but seem to just sort of comment on it or sort of approve it. And he says that he lost, what was it, 18 pounds. 12 pounds as a result of worrying about this. It will be perhaps granted that a man laboring to digest such novelties might lose 12 pounds. Certainly I should not have lost them had I not already taken seriously my experiences. I must repeat, I should have been so endlessly grateful and perhaps should have lost only 6 pounds instead of 12, if these people themselves had been more alarmed over their findings or had opposed to them a little ethical criticism. They might have said, unhappily, it looks as though things would follow this or that course. Consequently, one must take steps to warn people of what is coming and do one's best to prevent it. But what in a way they were saying was, it is coming, and when it is here, it will find us on the crest of the moment. It is interesting, it is even good, simply by virtue of being what is inevitably going to be. And to recognize it is sufficient of an achievement and satisfaction. It is not our affair to go on and do anything about it. But it probably is our affair to go on and do something about it if we recognize what is happening, which we perhaps can do through the study of history. What more can one say on this topic? I encourage people to study history simply because, again, the past is our only real guide to the future. And because terrible things that happen today are mirrored in things that happened before. Again, we go back to Thucydides. Greece, during the Peloponnesian War, the Second Peloponnesian War, was convulsed. The Athenians were fighting the Spartans, but they both had empires of more or less willing followers, and neutral cities were dragged into it until the whole of Greece was aflame, and the political passions aroused by this were very unpleasant. And what does Thucydides write? So revolutions broke out in city after city, and in places where the revolutions occurred late, the knowledge of what had happened previously in other places caused still new extravagances of revolutionary zeal, expressed by an elaboration in the methods of seizing power and by unheard of atrocities and revenge. To fit in with the change of events, words, too, had to change their meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfit for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. To plot successfully was a sign of intelligence, but it was even cleverer to see that a plot was hatching. If one attempted to provide against having to do either, one was disrupting the unity of the party and acting out of fear of the opposition. In short, it was equally praiseworthy to get one's blow in first against someone who was going to do wrong, and to denounce someone who had no intention of doing any wrong at all. Family relations were a weaker tie than party membership, since party members were more ready to go to any extreme for any reason whatsoever. These parties were not formed to enjoy the benefits of the established laws, but to acquire power by overthrowing the existing regime. And the members of these parties felt confidence in each other, not because of any fellowship in any religious communion, but because they were partners in crime. If an opponent made a reasonable speech, the party in power, so far from giving it a generous reception, took every precaution to see that it had no practical effect. This was in 410 BC, this stuff was happening. And yet you could print this in certain contexts and people would think it was a commentary on things in some countries in more recent times. It is astonishing what one can find in musty old history books if one takes the trouble to look into them. And finally, of course, we must look at the great power of historians. You may think this is sort of a comical conclusion that I'm about to make. And yet, let me tell you about the power of historians. You may not be aware that Winston Churchill was a great historian, in addition to this astonishing man's achievements in the field of politics, and even a little bit in painting. His 2-volume work on his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, is regarded as a classic and it is still studied. His History of World War I, from his own point of view, is a magisterial work. His History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and his 6-volume History of World War II, complete with all sorts of documentation, won him innumerable prizes. I don't know how anyone had time to do all this, but he's a remarkable man. It is said among the many, many anecdotes of Churchill that on one occasion, speaking to an opponent in the House of Commons, Churchill said, "History will not be kind to the honorable gentleman. I know, because I'll write the history." The power of historians. But to go back a little bit to another genius, Edward Gibbon, History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I heartily recommend its 3 volumes if you have the leisure to read them. not only a magisterial account that still has merit, this thing came out in the 1770s and 80s, that still has merit, but in a style so distinctive that you read one sentence by Gibbon, you know it's by Gibbon. The story is told of Edward Gibbon that he and a French physician were courting the same English noblewoman, Lady Elizabeth Foster. And then on one occasion, owing to some foul-up, they both arrived at her chateau at the same time, and she received them both. In the court, they didn't like each other very much, of course. In the course of the evening, Gibbon, who had a good supply of anecdotes, like most historians, seemed to be monopolizing the conversation, and finally the French doctor couldn't stand it any longer, and he exclaimed, when Lady Elizabeth Foster is sick from your stories, I will prescribe for her. And Gibbon looked at him and said, and when Lady Elizabeth Foster is dead from your medicine, I will make her immortal. And since I'm still telling this story about Lady Elizabeth Foster, I guess he did, didn't he? Historians, if we don't write it down, people forget it. People forget it sort of never happened. So never underestimate the power of historians, at least taken as a group. Theodore Hamerow was a very great history professor who summed up really my whole message this way. While reading or writing history for its predictive or inspirational or pedagogical qualities, we must remember that it is above all a self-sufficient discipline, important for its own sake. By providing a coherent, intelligible account of the past, it satisfies a profound human yearning for knowledge about our roots. It requires no justification other than that. We will go on studying history, whether it is taught in the classroom or not, whether it is supported or neglected by government agencies and philanthropic foundations, whether it ranks high or low on the constantly shifting scale of values on which the various branches of knowledge are weighed. We will study it because we must, because it broadens the cultural vision of mankind, because it expresses some essential quality of our existence as human beings. Our ultimate purpose in studying it, however, will remain the one expressed long ago at the first dawning of historical consciousness, that the deeds performed by men shall not be blotted out by time, and that the great and marvelous works of Greeks and foreigners shall not be without fame. Study history. It will repay that study as well as being very interesting.